Good afternoon and welcome to our monthly Lunch and Learn program with the Eisenhower Presidential Library. I am so thankful that you are here with us today. I'm so excited to welcome James Worthen to talk with us today. He's going to talk about a couple of Eisenhower administration members that perhaps we haven't really talked about a lot in the past. So James, why don't you take it away and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, thank you, Dawn. Thank you, Samantha. I'm really sorry I can't be there today. Unfortunately, we live in crazy times. So I'm here in Pismo Beach, California, speaking of where people are from, which is about halfway between Los Angeles and San Francisco. A nice place to be unless there's a fire going on behind you, which there was a few weeks ago. But I'm fine, and the weather is much better. My name is Jim Worthen. I'm a native Californian. Just to summarize, I spent my career at the Central Intelligence Agency after school and that sort of thing. And now I write American history with a focus on how personality affects political behavior. And since retiring, I've written 3 books on that subject. The one I'll discuss today, as you know, is it looks at Eisenhower's relationships with 2 of his more important cabinet members. So one question is, how did I get from the CIA to Eisenhower? Well, it's quite a story. Here's the short version. At the CIA, I had several jobs, but the one I think I enjoyed the most was chief of the Soviet or the Russian leadership division. And our job there was to write biographies of Russian officials. And we would give these biographies to American diplomats, and so they would know something about the Russians they were dealing with. You know, were they, friendly? Were they hostile? Were they evasive? Were they emotional? Were they logical? That sort of thing. So, So when I left the agency, I had so enjoyed this work, I decided I wanted to work in biography even more, and to change from Russians to writing about 20th century American political figures. And I especially wanted to do personality assessment, which I had been used to doing at the CIA. You think of all the personalities, all the politicians, who had big personalities and which fed into their leadership styles, people like Churchill and Roosevelt and Charles de Gaulle and Lyndon Johnson, of all people. So I decided to write about Richard Nixon as sort of a beginning, because Nixon was not only a Californian, but he was also an introvert in an extrovert's profession, which is quite a story. And so the book is called The Young Nixon and His Rivals, which you see on your screen. Most people don't realize this about Nixon, but at one time, he was only the 4th most important Republican politician in the state of California. And you see here on your screen some of the ones who are more important, Governor Earl Warren on the right, and Senator William Nolan on the left, and Warren's successor as governor, Goodwin Knight, kind of second from the left. So this book tells that story. And now you can perhaps see how I got from there to Eisenhower, because I became interested in the strange relationship between Nixon and Eisenhower that played out while Nixon was vice president. So I decided to look more closely at Eisenhower and how he worked with members of his cabinet. So here's the book on the screen. So why Humphrey and Wilson? Well, first, because they were businessmen, and one of the subplots in this book is the affinity that Ike had for members of the business community. You'll recall that he had a gang of buddies who he hunted and fished and played bridge with, and they were all businessmen. Eisenhower felt more comfortable with businessmen, as many of you know, than he did with other military officers. So why did, the question is, why did Eisenhower pick Humphrey and Wilson for these jobs. Another reason for focusing on them is that not much has been written about Humphrey or Wilson. They were the only, strikes me as interesting, that they were the only major figures in the Eisenhower administration who did not write memoirs or any kind of recollections of their service. They just went off and retired to their country estates and never looked back. So unfortunately, we lack a first-person feel for their experiences, but luckily we have the recollections of their colleagues and their subordinates, and of course the president they both worked for. So, who were Humphrey and Wilson? George Humphrey, who became Treasury Secretary, was the longtime head of a raw materials empire near the Great Lakes. His picture is coming up here. His main job before joining the Eisenhower administration was CEO of a company called M.A. Hanna. But if a company had anything to do with ore, iron ore, or coal, or steel, Humphrey had a hand in it. His great skills were business organization and management, and his specialty was acquiring unprofitable companies and turning them around. He had a razor-sharp mind. He was very self-assured. He was charming. He was persuasive. A competitor of his said that watching him in a boardroom was like the equivalent of a year at Harvard Business School. So you can imagine Humphrey was a pretty smooth character. By the 1940s, he controlled a variety of enterprises, including the largest coal company in the world, several banks, and all the while keeping such a low profile that when he was chosen as Treasury Secretary, nobody outside of Washington had the faintest idea who he was. So why was he selected? Well, that's a long story too, but the short version is that he would bring a business perspective into running the nation's economy. The problem was he had no experience in government, and he was not an economist, and being an economist certainly helped in that kind of a job. Now, Wilson, at the time he was chosen for the cabinet, was much better known. He was president of the largest company in the world, General Motors. A picture of him is coming up. Actually, this is a picture of the big three automakers in the 1940s. You see on the left the head of Studebaker, and on the right, Edsel Ford, who was running Ford Motor Company at the time, and Wilson in the middle. These guys were very important people, and GM, under Wilson's leadership, as you probably know, retooled his entire auto assembly line into weapons production. And if it hadn't been for all the weapons that GM produced during the war, the Allies might well have not won, have not been victorious. So he was an important guy who had been on the cover of Time and Newsweek by then. And so people had a fairly good idea of who Wilson was. Now, he was a very different kind of guy, different kind of executive than George Humphrey. He'd been trained as an engineer, and he kind of had an engineer's way of approaching problems. He was a data collector. He had a hard time making decisions until he knew all there was to know about the subject. He enjoyed immersing himself in details, and these tendencies would later prove to be a liability in his next job. And why was he selected? Mainly because Eisenhower wanted the Pentagon to be managed well, and the thought was that Wilson, managing the world's largest company, would probably be a good choice. And with his experience in the defense production, he would probably even know something about weapons production. So to summarize, Humphrey and Wilson were stereotypical businessmen. They were Midwestern. They were privileged, had privileged backgrounds. They were very conservative. And they took office with the Eisenhower team in March 1953. And let me briefly tell you the kind of challenges they were facing in this job. Some realities that are important to keep in mind. As you know, Republicans had been out of power for 20 years, almost an entire generation. The country had come through a really trying time, World War II, the Depression. Now the Korean War was going on, and all of these have required lots and lots of money. So, and Truman had even left Eisenhower with an $8 billion budget deficit, which Eisenhower felt was shockingly high. So it was safe to assume when these guys came into power in 1953 that there would be deep cuts in spending. But it was still not entirely clear what kind of president Eisenhower was. He clearly had conservative instincts, but he was known more for being a war hero than a strong political partisan. As you know, he got upset when anybody suggested that he do something for political reasons. He just wasn't that kind of guy. In fact, he talked frequently about how the best policy on any issue was somewhere near the middle of the road. How many politicians in the last 50 years have you heard say that? Pardon me for a second. So Truman had even told Eisenhower back in 1948 that if Eisenhower ran for president as a Democrat, Truman would support him. So it was really unclear what direction Eisenhower would lean when he came into power. Now, he was no economist, but he had worked on budgets in the Army, and he clearly understood balance sheets. And it seemed obvious to him that money coming in had to equal money going out. Besides, Eisenhower had a belief that deficits were a national security issue. They would lead to inflation and they'd weaken the economy, and this would make it harder to compete with the Russians. So if anything was clear, it was that the new administration would not spend a lot of money on new programs. So even though there were economic policy issues, the focus here is on personality and style. For one thing, economic policy is not all that riveting to most people. And second, I'm not really an economist myself. So the book really focuses on the stylistic aspects of Humphrey, Eisenhower, and Wilson. And the first question that you might ask is how Wilson and Humphrey adapted to their new environment. You could say that Humphrey took official Washington by storm. He did a series of interviews with newspapers, and all the journalists came away very impressed, and they said so. In the papers, one correspondent wrote, "You can imagine him going into a frantic board of directors meeting and calming it with a few practical and common sense words." So when Ike and his advisors began meeting, everyone agreed that Humphrey was by far the smoothest guy in the room. And as you know, Eisenhower took cabinet government very seriously. Early on, he was relatively uninformed about domestic policy. So he kind of learned a lot from hearing the members argue and debate with each other. And the cabinet minutes were fascinating because Eisenhower would often play devil's advocate. He'd go back and forth, all the while learning from all these heavyweights in the room, kind of on the job. Now, Humphrey was a natural in this setting. He always came in totally prepared. And if there was a long debate at the cabinet meeting, he would be the first to suggest a reasonable course of action. And so bringing up a picture here of Eisenhower and Humphrey, These two guys clicked immediately. Eisenhower had never met Humphrey, interestingly enough, before choosing him. But he liked him immediately. He was so impressed that within a few months, he was inviting Humphrey to join his gang at golf and bridge vacations on weekends. One of these cronies of Eisenhower's, a guy named Cliff Roberts, later wrote that the remarkable thing about Humphrey was that he was a terrible golfer and a lousy bridge player. Roberts said that he had absolutely no card sense, and that they tried to teach him golf and get him all the right equipment, but he never caught on to it. But Ike and the rest just enjoyed his fellowship, just having him around. So he must have been quite a charming man. Now, this closeness to the president was kind of a problem because it gave him a tremendous advantage as an advisor. I mean, who knew what these guys had agreed to in advance, or to what extent Humphrey spoke for the president on any given occasion? Now, if Ike was interested in cutting spending, Humphrey was absolutely obsessed by it. He came into office determined to challenge every penny spent by the government. So at every cabinet meeting, Humphrey would hammer home the message that every department had to stop unnecessary spending. He later told a friend, this is a quote, it just had to come up every day. You had to keep working at it all the time. And Humphrey did. Any meeting that, whatever the subject matter is, he said, you've got to stop, you've got to hold spending down. And it was risky to oppose him openly because everyone knew that I also favored spending cuts. People like John Foster Dulles were a little bit upset by all this. He didn't like this penny pinching. He felt that winning the Cold War, took whatever it took in terms of spending money. But Humphrey was a hard guy to dislike and a hard guy to stay mad at. So Humphrey tended to win these battles, and Humphrey's anti-spending campaign had Eisenhower's full support. So now we turn to Wilson. And if Humphrey's term of office took off like a rocket, by contrast, Wilson's beginning in Washington did not go well. It was partly a matter of style. He was relatively unpolished, especially for an executive, and he had kind of a hard time finding the right words to express himself, especially in public. As you know, he barely got through his confirmation hearings because he initially refused to sell his stocks and bonds. I think he had a government salary coming of $22,000, and his annual salary at GM was $600,000 or more. So he was a bit nervous about giving up his money. But in the process, he upset many congressmen with his stubbornness and sometimes his unfortunate choice of words. The other problem was Wilson's unorthodox approach to management, which became a problem at the Pentagon right from the beginning. Wilson was known at GM for his very leisurely style. He never seemed to be in a hurry, whether it was getting somewhere or ending a meeting or making a decision. And now he was in charge of an organization with a very different culture. And coming up soon is a picture of Wilson with his military staff. On the left, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, William Radford, and then Eisenhower and Wilson and Omar Bradley, General Bradley on the right. So these were Wilson's new subordinates. And unfortunately, the Pentagon is a top-down bureaucracy comprised primarily of Army, Navy, and Air Force officers who are used to specific orders, not endless bull sessions. So to be effective, pardon me, it seemed that Wilson would have to adapt to that culture. But he didn't. In fact, the service chiefs quickly learned to dread a meeting with him late in the day because Wilson had no sense of time, and they'd probably be there all night. They wanted him to be more crisp and decisive. Army officers in particular complained that he didn't really understand the Army's needs, the Army's requirements. One general said that he was uninformed and determined to remain so. Not exactly a compliment. Another big problem for Eisenhower was, for Wilson, was that his boss, Eisenhower, knew far more about the Pentagon than he did. It was almost a no-win situation. So here is where Humphrey, Wilson, and Eisenhower come together in a struggle that would last for several years. All of Wilson's problems were compounded by Humphrey's budget cuts. Because in the early 1950s, 70% of federal spending was on defense. So if you're going to cut the budget, it's going to have to be defense spending. So another problem was that Eisenhower was just not inclined to believe Pentagon arguments to keep its budgets up. As a career Army guy, he well knew that money was being wasted at the Pentagon. He understood how fiercely parochial the Army and Navy and Air Force were, even though that he had long encouraged them to think, more in the terms of the national interest. What bothered him especially was redundancy, the fact that the services were all kind of working on similar capabilities that would overlap and result in a waste of money. So this meant that Eisenhower and Humphrey expected Wilson to go in the Pentagon and knock heads together right at the very beginning. So before Wilson had even learned the ins and outs of a complex government agency, he had to come in and shake things up, all the while trying to gain the trust of the admirals and generals who worked for him. As you can imagine, this made him feel just a bit insecure. So he began bothering Eisenhower over and over again for meetings, taking up Ike's time to go over details until Ike would explode, "I won't run the Pentagon, that's your job." And everyone around Eisenhower, from his secretary Ann Whitman to his brother Milton, knew that Ike's hand-holding of Wilson was a major time waster for him. But he had a very generous nature and had a hard time saying no. Another problem for Wilson was counter pressure from Congress. Many congressmen thought cutting the military was just not very smart during a Cold War. In particular, as time went along, Senator Stuart Symington, who was a former Air Force secretary, was second-guessing Wilson at just about every turn. Finally, as if matters could get worse or needed to get worse, a new policy came along called the New Look, which many of you are familiar with, which emphasized nuclear weapons over conventional weapons because they were cheaper. Ike and his advisors felt that any confrontation with the Russians would probably escalate into a nuclear exchange, and that therefore large standing armies were just not that necessary. And both Ike and Humphrey loved the fact that the New Look would save a lot of money. So this gave Wilson a whole new set of problems, because for one thing, it would destabilize the resource balance among the services. I mean, the Air Force and Army and Navy had always had kind of an equal share of resources, and now all of a sudden the Air Force budget would go way up and the Army budget would be cut to the bone. And so for the next several years, the Army fiercely fought the Air Force and Wilson over this issue. And coming up next is a graphic from the famous Washington Post cartoonist back in the 50s and 60s, a man named Herb Bloch, who was probably the political cartoonist in America, most famous one, which shows Wilson coming out of his office and watching the Air Force and Army shooting at each other, and he's saying, "Not in the corridors, damn it." So this encapsulated the problem that Wilson had. Now, on the one hand, the Army was just protecting itself, but it had some legitimate concerns. I mean, they foresaw correctly that the Cold War would probably not involve a nuclear war, but would play out in the Third World, where conventional armies would be very important. And this seemed obvious to most congressional Democrats as well. So for the next few years, this parade of Army officers, famous ones like Matthew Ridgway, a World War II hero, Maxwell Taylor, would testify before Congress. They'd write books, they'd make speeches saying that the new look was folly and that Wilson was stupid to be behind it. Now, when the Army went public over these budget cuts, Eisenhower was absolutely furious. And nothing made him more angry than that kind of disloyalty. Now, Wilson's trying to see both sides of the spending issue, and he occasionally had the temerity to argue that the cuts were too extreme. He would sometimes go off message and tell the press that, "Oh, we can't make any more cuts without affecting military readiness." But this made Eisenhower even madder. And so now you see another cartoon from Herb Bloch, where you see John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State, walking with Wilson, who looks very downhearted. And he's saying, "The trouble with you, Charlie, is that you say what you think." So things were just not happy at all for Wilson. And one of the problems was that Eisenhower continued to make negative comments about Wilson over and over again. He would say things like, "He comes in here and sits here and asks me questions about the details of his own job. If he wasn't able to do them, he shouldn't have the job." And then he would say, "Damn it, how did a man as shallow as Charlie Wilson ever get to be head of General Motors?" And on another occasion, he says, "Well, I think he considers himself a master of public relations. He seems to have no comprehension of all the embarrassment his remarks can cause." So this was Wilson's, burden. For 2 years, he went along like this. And if you fast forward during that time, the administration was successful in attaining a couple of balanced budgets, mainly because of defense cuts. So Ike and Humphrey considered all the turmoil at the Pentagon worthwhile. But when Humphrey left office in 1957, he was still unhappy with his inability to cut even more. But toward the end, his poor wife, Jessie, had had enough. Here you see a picture coming up of Eisenhower and the Wilsons, Jessie and his wife. And Jessie went to a Washington Post columnist, which she probably shouldn't have done. And she told him it would be nice if I could give her husband a slap on the back once in a while. He works 7 days a week, she said, and I stood back and listened to criticism until I'm disgusted with it. So this was Wilson's unhappy lot. And on the other hand, while my book is a story about Wilson and his troubles, it's also an account of Eisenhower and Humphrey as recession fighters. And I'll conclude with a little bit about that. Now, why is it important? Why was it important for Eisenhower to worry about a recession. It's easy to forget one of the main concerns of the incoming administration was to prove to the country that the Republicans could handle the economy without falling into a depression, which Herbert Hoover had done 20 years before. This was really a sensitive issue for them. So the big question always was, how much should the government do during a recession? You know, what kind of action should they take? Businessmen like Humphrey said, don't do anything, because the market will always fix itself without any kind of tampering. And besides that, when you do that, you ruin business confidence by doing things to indicate that you're worried about the economy. But Ike knew this was a sensitive issue, and he kept reassuring the country that he would use the full power of the government in dealing with any economic downturn, which was what Roosevelt had done during the Depression. Well, this was heresy to the business community, especially to Humphrey. And so you knew there would be some sort of tension if a recession did rear its ugly head. And sure enough, it did. The big test came in late 1953 when there was a business slump. It turned into a recession. And so the trouble began. And I should point out at this point that there were other players in economic policymaking besides Humphrey and Eisenhower. One of them was Arthur Burns. Arthur Burns is kind of a very well-known character in administrations to follow. As you remember, he went on to be Nixon's economic advisor, and back then he was, under Eisenhower, he was chief of the Council of Economic Advisors. He was an economist with a specialist in economic forecasting, which seemed a perfect fit for Ike's concerns. Now, people were worried that Burns would come across as too much of what they called an egghead back then, you know, an intellectual. But instead, Eisenhower just really enjoyed Burns's presentations to the cabinet, and he learned a lot from them. Now, another economic player in this was a guy named Gabe Hogue. And Hogue was a kind of a White House insider. He'd been a speechwriter for Eisenhower during the campaign, the 1952 presidential campaign, a good friend of Ike's by that point, and he was known for giving sound, practical advice. So now Burns and Hogue, though they were fairly conservative, were much more liberal than Humphrey, and that fact guaranteed some conflict as they tried to figure out how to deal with what turned out to be a pretty minor recession. In the book, I described in detail the kind of inconclusive and contentious debates that took place. Somebody at the cabinet would say, maybe we should do something, you know, start a public works program or recommend some tax cuts. And Humphrey would always say, no, if we do these things, it will send a message to the business community that we're worried, and our worry will be contagious. And in these debates, Eisenhower would kind of flip back and forth. He would unable to decide really what to do. He took one side and then the other side. But by default, he always seemed to side with Humphrey, who always advised Eisenhower to do nothing. In the meantime, behind the scenes, Humphrey and Burns were kind of carrying on a quiet argument. Burns wrote later that Humphrey would pound the table and raise his voice. He said that he'd run a big business and he wasn't going to have professors tell him how to run the Treasury Department. Burns and his staff didn't see running a business as all that relevant. And they called Humphrey an economic illiterate, not only illiterate, but uneducable. So there was some tension between these guys. Burns' successor was a guy named Raymond Saulnier, who you see here in the middle. On the left is Sherman Adams, the well-known staff chief for Eisenhower, and Burns is on the right. But even Saulnier criticized Humphrey, but he said it more politely. He said his quick responses tended to be a little disconcerting to the academic and reflective mind. So with these kinds of feelings, it's a wonder that the strong disagreement that they occasionally had did not make the newspapers. But it was a different era, and Ike's people were very loyal to him. You didn't have people, going outside and talking to the media, except maybe the Army officers that I mentioned. In the end, doing nothing turned out to be a successful course of non-action because the economy revived and it expanded rapidly beginning in mid-1954. Now, Humphrey felt vindicated, but Ike arguably learned the wrong lesson, that doing nothing would always be the right thing to do. And of course, a few years later in 1957, there'd be a more serious recession, but this was after Humphrey had resigned. In the end, Ike internalized most of Humphrey's advice. And after Humphrey left, as Treasury Secretary, Ike appointed an even more conservative Treasury Secretary, a guy named Robert Anderson. And as time went along, inflation became Eisenhower's main concern, and cutting spending continued to be his main weapon. Now, Eisenhower was always conflicted about this because he could always, he was a guy who enjoyed being in the middle of the road all the time. And that meant that he always saw both sides of an issue. And here's a quote that clearly shows that Ike had two minds about this issue. He said, "Frankly, I'd rather see the Congress cut $1 billion off the defense budget as much as I think it would be a mistake." So, he was listening to people who wanted to spend more. He was listening to Humphrey, and he was trying hardest to bring the two thoughts together. So let me give you a quick couple of takeaways from my research in the 3 or 4 minutes that I have left. Eisenhower, I think he paid a price for picking these men to be in his cabinet. Wilson was a liability. He couldn't really manage the Pentagon. He made unfortunate comments. He monopolized the president's time. But through it all, it appears that Eisenhower never really considered replacing Wilson. He must have reasoned that Wilson was doing the best job that he could, that breaking in a new defense secretary would be, less efficient than continuing with the old one. And maybe more importantly, that team chemistry was important. He said at the beginning of his administration that he took great care in picking this gang, and he was very loyal to it. And so here we have a picture coming up of Eisenhower saying goodbye to Wilson, clearly with some affection. And with some ambivalence. Now, with regard to Humphrey, it was quite different. Eisenhower was close to tears when his term ended because they were very close. But I think Humphrey's obsession with inflation and spending had a political price. And this is certainly debatable. I should say at this point, looking back from the 21st century, this preoccupation with budget balancing and spending seems almost quaint. The U.S. budget deficit last year was over $900 billion, and yet Ike and Humphrey would agonize about being a few $1 million in the red, which would be a rounding error by today's standards. But back in the 50s, budget balancing was Republican orthodoxy, and we can't really be too critical of it. Still, it can be argued, and I kind of argue this in the book, that the constant pressure to economize created a climate that discouraged the development of new programs to address growing social problems. And after the Sputnik shock, you know, when the Russians put up their satellite in 1957, it raised the question of why America seemed to be falling behind the Russians in science and technology. Was it because of a lack of investment? And this nagging doubt, I think, fed into the election of 1960. The ultimate question was, would a more expansive government policy have led to a Nixon victory over Kennedy in 1960? Kennedy kept arguing that the country had to get moving again, and in some ways, Eisenhower's spending policies contributed to that perception. And as you know, Nixon privately complained to Eisenhower about refusing to stimulate the economy in a presidential election year. The thing is, everybody was very loyal to Eisenhower, and the final takeaway that I have from this, from doing the research, is that you rarely saw criticism of Eisenhower in the press. Both Wilson and Humphrey were strongly committed to a president that they both admired. I don't know if we've seen the picture of Eisenhower's birthday party, but everybody came together on occasions like this to honor their president. And here you see Humphrey on the left, and Richard Nixon, and then John Foster Dulles and Mamie behind, and Eisenhower accepting this present, and Charles Wilson on the right. They loved Eisenhower. They were loyal to him, and they were committed to his success. And I think that speaks volumes about Eisenhower, the kind of president he was, his ability to evaluate and motivate people, and his ability to make practical decisions based on the needs of the moment rather than on some kind of ideology. So with that, I think I'll stop. I may have gone on too long, and see if there are any questions.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you. Anything about the CIA would be fine too, or my book, whatever you'd like.
We're going to give everybody a moment just to sort of think about what they'd like to ask, but I'll start it off just to give everybody a little time. You didn't mention anything about Eisenhower's expenditures on the St. Lawrence Seaway or the interstate system, and how do those massive projects roll into this financial conservatism that you mentioned earlier?
That's interesting. The St. Lawrence Seaway was a big issue early in the administration. And Humphrey, it's interesting, Humphrey had a business interest in seeing the Seaway built because he had a contract to ship iron ore from one end of the St. Lawrence Seaway as it was projected to the other. And so he was trying to lobby Eisenhower to build it, but at the same time, not become too obvious about it. But yeah, the St. Lawrence Seaway was an issue early in the administration. Of course, it wasn't completed until much later, but it didn't become a big spending issue as I understand it. And the other issue you mentioned was
interstate.
The interstate thing. You know, the interstate system, interestingly, Humphrey was a big supporter of it. And the reason was it could be done primarily off budget. It was not a budget item. They decided to finance the interstate system through highway taxes. And so the whole thing got built, or most of it got built without really making a dent in the budget. So for that reason, people like Humphrey could really get behind it.
Thank you for that.
Sure.
Okay, so if anyone would like to offer a question, turn your microphone off of mute from the white bar at the bottom of your screen. I'm going to change my screen so I can see everybody. I know I'm sure we have some questions in here. Anyone? We're all shy today, Jim.
I may have to talk more about the CIA.
Okay, let's do.
It's interesting, a place to work at the CIA. I feel almost bad today because that kind of job is fast disappearing. The kind of job where you go into one line of work and you stay there, for your entire career. And that just doesn't happen any longer. It's sort of like the CIA, at least, was kind of joining a big family, of, security measures and doors that were vaults and, classified material everywhere and, precautions of various kinds. It was really kind of a wonderful world. And I feel very lucky to have worked in an environment where, where your longevity was kind of assured. You could stay there as long as you wanted and have a number of different kinds of jobs, a lot of variety within a 30-year career. And I think the only kinds of careers where that's still possible is in government, primarily federal government, and maybe even less often there.
That's true. We have a handful of employees who have been here for their whole careers. Some of them are listening right now. We did get a question in the chat box. Gordon asks, how about the meaning of Ike's speech statement, military-industrial complex? Many different opinions on that. What is yours?
I forgot to mention that I think Eisenhower's experience, his frustration with the military budget led directly to his military-industrial complex comment. I mean, he saw the military throughout his term as kind of standing in the way, kind of wielding its power to stand in the way of budget cuts. And this made him very frustrated. And I think it led directly to his military-industrial complex comment. He saw how hard it was to prevent the military from lobbying the public, for greater expenditures. And then, of course, as the defense industry accumulated power, all more and more things were being contracted out to different companies around the country, and they all had a vested interest in increased budgets as well. So I think he correctly saw the military-industrial complex as something to be warned against, and I think time showed that he was right.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Jim, why don't you tell us how to get your book?
Yeah, of course, the easy way would be on Amazon. Amazon is selling all three of my books. My publisher, pardon me, is McFarland, and their website is mcfarlandpub.com. But as I say, Amazon is an easier way to get them. My website, which is currently being shown on the screen, is called jamesworthen.com. And on the website, I don't have any information about the Eisenhower book yet because it's fairly recent, but it tells you a bit about me and a bit about my approach to history and something about my background at the CIA. And a summary of my first two books, the one on Nixon that I mentioned, that you're kind of looking at right now, and the one right below it on a Depression era governor of California named James Rolfe, which I assume most of your audience would not be greatly interested in. But the common element in all of these books is that the people I choose to work on and with have personalities that fed into their politics and their leadership styles, sometimes their insecurities, and you had to focus on more than just what they said, what their ideologies were. You had to focus on more on what kind of people they were. And each of the people I write about kind of meets that criterion.
Well, I'm sure once we reopen, we'll have your book in our gift shop.
Oh, good. I hope so.
So that'll be another opportunity. Well, if there are no more questions, I'll go ahead and do our final closing announcements. Is that okay with everyone? So first of all, as always, I'd like to thank the Eisenhower Foundation. Through the Eisenhower Foundation, we are able to promote and have programs like this for our adult education. And we got funding this year from the Union Pacific Foundation for our public programs. So thank you to both of those organizations. Our next program, our Evenings at Ease program in October 13th, will feature Susan Eisenhower. And we are so excited that she's going to be able to do this with us. Much like Jim, everything had to change because of the pandemic and a lack of ability to travel, but Susan will still be available to speak to us on the 13th. And it's about her new book, How Ike Led. Several of us have already read it or in the middle of reading it. It's very good. I hope you can join us for that. And for our next Lunch and Learn, October 22nd, we have Karine Porter. Karine is the curator of the Archives building, the National Archives building on Pennsylvania Avenue. Karine put together an exhibit called Rightfully Hers, and it's about the 19th Amendment. And so Karine will talk to us about that exhibit. I'm really excited that we get to share some National Archives and Records Administration stuff for our Lunch and Learn. And then our next book talk is November the 10th, and we will be reading and discussing To Hell and Back. The movie's available to stream as well. This is a book about Audie Murphy's time during World War II. I'm looking forward to that, and Jeff will be our moderator again. So that'll be wonderful for us to share and talk about. So I guess I'll go ahead and close up and say thank you, Jim. Thank you so much for being here. We're really looking forward to having you come back to the Eisenhower Library one day.
You're very welcome. I hope to do that.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.